The night air carried a sharp chill as James Whitmore's sleek black car rolled quietly through the empty streets toward his sprawling mansion at the edge of the city, its headlights slicing through the darkness. James, a man whose name was synonymous with wealth and power, leaned back in his seat, mentally reviewing tomorrow's meetings, mergers, and numbers that meant more to him than most human connections ever had. Beside him, nestled into the leather seat, his 6-year-old daughter Lily pressed her tiny face against the window, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of wonder and curiosity that seemed untouched by the world's harshness. She was the very heart of his life, the only reminder of the wife he had lost too soon, and the one thing that could still draw softness out of the steel that success had built around him. As the car pulled closer to the towering gates of their estate, Lily suddenly sat up straight, tugging at her father's sleeve with urgency, her small finger pointing out the window. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice quivering with both concern and innocence, "why is she sleeping outside?" James frowned, following her gaze toward the shadowed corner of the iron gates, and there he saw her, a young woman curled up on the cold ground, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though the thin blanket she clutched was her last fragile defense against the bitter night. Her face, illuminated faintly by the streetlight, was pale and weary, framed by hair that fell in tangled strands around her shoulders. She looked no older than her mid-20s, yet her eyes, half closed in exhaustion, carried a heaviness that spoke of battles fought and lost. For a moment, James hesitated. He was no stranger to poverty existing outside his carefully maintained world of glass towers and business deals, but to see it this close, to see it at his very gates, was unsettling. He cleared his throat and tried to reassure Lily, "Sweetheart, don't worry about her. She's probably just resting. Someone will come along and help." But Lily didn't release his sleeve, her grip tightened, and her eyes filled with something James recognized immediately, compassion, the very trait his late wife had embodied, the very thing that always unsettled him because it forced him to feel. "Daddy, she's cold. Please, can we help her?" Her words, soft yet urgent, cut deeper than any boardroom argument ever could. James let out a long breath, staring once more at the fragile figure outside his gates, and in that moment, the walls he so carefully built around himself cracked just enough. He signaled for the driver to stop. The car doors opened, and James stepped into the cold air, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The woman stirred at the sound, her body tensing as though ready to run, fear flashing in her eyes when she saw a tall, imposing man approaching. But then she noticed the little girl beside him, holding his hand tightly, her expression pure and kind, and she froze in place. Lily smiled gently, her voice barely louder than a whisper, "Don't be scared. You can come inside." The woman's lips parted as though she wanted to protest, but the warmth in Lily's eyes disarmed her completely. James, watching silently, felt a strange stirring in his chest, an unfamiliar weight that wasn't discomfort but something far more dangerous, empathy. For years, he had told himself his heart was untouchable, locked away after the pain of loss, but now, standing at his own gates in the cold night, with his daughter looking up at him expectantly and a stranger shivering before him, James realized that perhaps he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. And with a reluctant but resolute nod, he extended his hand. "Come inside," he said firmly, though his voice was softer than usual. And just like that, the door James never thought he'd open began to unlock, not just for the young woman at his gate but for his own guarded heart. "Emma," that was the name the young woman finally whispered after stepping hesitantly into the mansion, her voice so soft it almost got lost in the vastness of the grand hall, where crystal chandeliers glowed warmly overhead and marble floors gleamed beneath her trembling feet. She looked utterly out of place in her worn-out shoes and threadbare coat, the weight of her exhaustion heavy on her shoulders, as if each step inside this palace was an intrusion she did not deserve. James walked slightly behind her, his sharp eyes studying her cautiously, still unsure if opening his door had been a wise choice or a reckless impulse born out of his daughter's tender heart. Lily, on the other hand, had no such doubts. She rushed ahead, her little hands dragging a blanket from the couch, which she quickly draped over Emma's shoulders as if she were crowning a queen. "Here," Lily said with an earnest smile that could melt the coldest soul, "this one's warm, and it's my favorite. You can have it." Emma froze, staring at the small girl in disbelief, her lips parting as tears pooled in her tired eyes, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she whispered words filled with fragile gratitude, "Thank you." James felt a strange ache in his chest at the sight, a mix of unease and something softer, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He ordered the staff to bring food, and when Emma sat at the dining table, she ate with the hunger of someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days, though she tried to hide her desperation by taking small bites, embarrassed to be seen in such need. Lily, perched beside her, chattered happily about her toys, her school, and her favorite bedtime stories, filling the silence with a brightness that wrapped around Emma like a bomb. For the first time in months, Emma felt visible, not as a burden to be ignored on a cold street corner, but as a person sitting at a table, being spoken to, being fed, being cared for. Later that evening, when Lily had finally skipped upstairs to prepare for bed, James remained in the dining room with Emma, his sharp features hardened once more as he folded his arms and asked the question that had been pressing against his lips since she arrived, "Why were you outside my gate, Emma? Why here?" The young woman lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket Lily had given her, and after a long pause, she spoke, her words fractured by both shame and pain. "I didn't know it was your house," she confessed quietly. "I was walking until my legs gave out, and I couldn't go any further. I've been searching for work for weeks. I used to teach at a small school, but when it shut down, I lost everything. I tried to hold on, I really did, but the rent, the bills, the empty cupboards. I couldn't keep up. I thought I was strong, but the truth is," her voice cracked, "the truth is I have nothing left." Her honesty filled the room, stark and heavy, and James leaned back in his chair, his sharp mind torn between suspicion and compassion. His instincts, honed from years of building empires, warned him that people always wanted something from him, that desperation could disguise deception, but another part of him, the part awakened by his daughter's simple kindness, saw not a liar but a young woman crushed under the weight of a world that had turned its back on her. "You'll be safe here tonight," he said finally, his voice clipped yet laced with a softness he hadn't meant to reveal. "Tomorrow, we'll decide what comes next." Emma's eyes lifted, shimmering with tears that she quickly blinked away, and she whispered again, "Thank you," though her heart was racing, torn between fear of being cast back into the cold and a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the warmth she felt in this house might last more than one night. Upstairs, Lily peeked down the stairwell, her small hands gripping the railing as she smiled knowingly, because in her child's heart she already believed Emma was meant to stay, not just for a night, but for something far greater. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, gilding the marble floors and casting a soft glow across the grand hall, yet James found little comfort in its beauty as he sat at the long dining table with his coffee untouched, his mind drifting back to the stranger upstairs who had spent the night under his roof. He was a man accustomed to control, to ensuring every detail of his life was calculated and secure, but Emma's presence disrupted that carefully maintained order, stirring questions he hadn't asked himself in years. His daughter, however, was already smitten with their unexpected guest. Lily came bounding down the stairs, her hair in a messy braid, her face lit with excitement as she declared, "Daddy, Emma read me a story last night before bed, and she does all the voices just like Mommy used to." The word struck James's chest with a sharp pang, reminding him of the laughter that had once filled these halls before grief had silenced it. He had spent years building walls around his heart, believing it safer to bury himself in work and wealth than to face the ache of loss, but watching Lily beam at Emma with unguarded affection began to chip away at that fortress in ways he wasn't prepared for. Emma, for her part, tried to keep her distance, moving carefully through the house like a guest who feared overstaying her welcome, offering to fold laundry, tidy the kitchen, or read to Lily while James worked. There was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, as though she was determined not to be seen as a burden, and that dignity tugged at James's guarded respect even as he fought to remain detached. Each evening he found himself observing her from the shadows of his study, noticing the small details he didn't want to notice, the way she smoothed Lily's hair with a tenderness that echoed a mother's touch, the soft hum of her voice when she thought no one was listening, the fleeting sadness that crossed her eyes when she caught her reflection in the glass. One evening, after tucking Lily into bed, Emma hesitated outside James's study, finally knocking with a timid hand. He looked up from his desk, his stern expression masking the curiosity that stirred inside him. "I don't want to be a burden," she said quietly, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. "You've already given me more kindness than I deserve. I'll leave tomorrow morning, and I wanted to say thank you before I go." Her words unsettled him more than he cared to admit, and he set down his pen, leaning back in his chair as he studied her carefully. "And where would you go?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. Emma swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "But this isn't my world, Mr. Whitmore. I don't belong in a place like this." The silence stretched between them, heavy with truths neither wanted to voice. James realized then how hollow his mansion had felt for years, how its endless halls had been filled with nothing but echoes until Emma's laughter with Lily had brought life back into its walls. His instincts told him to let her go, to keep his life simple and untouched, but his heart, a heart he thought had long been buried, was beginning to stir with something dangerously close to need. At that very moment, Lily came rushing in, her small arms wrapping tightly around Emma's waist as she pleaded, "Daddy, please let her stay. She makes us happy." James felt his resolve falter, the sight of his daughter's desperate little face cutting through his defenses like a blade, and though he said nothing aloud, deep within, he knew the decision had already been made. Emma wasn't meant to walk back into the cold, she was meant to stay, not just for Lily, but for him, for the life he hadn't realized he was still longing for. Weeks melted into months, and what had begun as a single night of shelter slowly blossomed into something neither James nor Emma could have predicted, the rhythms of their lives intertwining in quiet, almost imperceptible ways until her presence no longer felt like that of a guest but of someone who belonged. Emma, once fragile and hesitant, had begun to find her footing again. She took on small tutoring jobs in the neighborhood, and in the evenings, she brought that same gentle patience into the Whitmore home, helping Lily with her schoolwork, baking simple treats in the kitchen, and filling the air with warmth that had long been absent. James, ever the cautious man, tried at first to keep his distance, reminding himself that she was just a temporary visitor, a woman he had helped out of kindness and nothing more, but the more he watched her, the harder it became to deny the truth stirring inside him. She was changing not only Lily's world but his own. He found himself lingering in doorways to hear her laughter with Lily, pausing his work just to catch glimpses of her humming softly as she folded laundry, and noticing the way the house itself seemed lighter with her in it, as if the walls had been waiting all along for someone to breathe life back into them. One late evening, after a long day at the office, James walked into the living room and stopped in his tracks, his breath catching as he saw Emma curled on the couch with a book in hand, reading aloud in her soft, melodic voice while Lily nestled against her side, already half asleep. The sight pierced him with an ache he hadn't felt in years, a bittersweet reminder of what he had lost and a fragile hope of what he might find again. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so as not to wake Lily. "Emma," he murmured, and she looked up quickly, her cheeks flushing as though she had been caught trespassing in a world not her own. But before she could speak, James continued, his tone gentler than it had ever been. "You've given her joy again, and me too. This house, it hasn't felt like home for a very long time. Not until you." Emma's lips parted, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she couldn't fathom the sincerity behind his words. "James, I don't want to take advantage of your kindness," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've done so much already. I could never ask for more." But James shook his head slowly, stepping closer, his gaze steady on hers. "You didn't ask. But life has a way of giving us what we need when we least expect it." At that moment, Lily stirred, her sleepy voice cutting through the fragile tension as she mumbled, "Daddy, she's home now, right?" Her innocent words hung in the air, heavy with truth, and James felt the last of his resistance crumble. He bent down, tucking the blanket snugly around both Emma and Lily, his hand lingering for a moment on Emma's shoulder in silent reassurance, and he smiled softly, his voice firm yet tender. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, his eyes never leaving Emma's. "She's home." Emma's breath hitched, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear, relief, and something dangerously close to love, and though tears welled in her eyes, they were not tears of sorrow but of a soul rediscovering belonging. In that instant, the man who once believed his life was too full of wealth to ever need anything more realized that all the riches in the world meant nothing compared to the warmth of a family gathered under one roof, the laughter of a child, and the quiet strength of a woman who had stumbled into his life on a cold night outside his gate. He had opened his door that evening out of reluctant compassion, but what he had truly opened was his heart, and with Emma and Lily by his side, James Whitmore finally knew he would never close it again.